indigenous peoples and to some extent also local community at a alarming level. We've seen a number of people being displaced, their rights being abused, but also arbitrary arrests for being found in these, what they call protected areas. We also see a number of emerging policies, global policies, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework, where that by 30 is becoming a big issue because it means more and more people, indigenous people, should be displaced if the issues to do with land rights are not respected and recognized. I think the Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Francisco Cali, has done a number of thematic reports around issues about indigenous people's rights in relation to conservation. And I think also the human rights norms around conservation issues and also around funding organizations being developed by UNEP are very important. We need to see conservation organizations and funders respect indigenous people's rights and also integrate those rights into their own policy documents. We need them to see those organizations do due diligence so that to see and how mechanisms to address human rights of indigenous peoples that are potentially to be abused by creating of new conservation areas or protected areas. And also we need to see more robust focus and support for indigenous peoples and local community organizations being supported to undertake their own conservation according to their own indigenous visions and also livelihoods. It is very imperative that organizations also dealing with the conservation and or conservation funding agencies to respect the customary and traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. They have for many years contributed to conservation and biodiversity in their own ways and means. It's very also important to have more dialogue on these issues at national levels and ensure that national biodiversity adaptation plans or what kind of mechanism countries have to address human-wildlife conflicts that are increasing in many countries, including Kenya. So I would really like to see that the Human Rights Council in future take strong measures to ensure that human rights abuses in relation to conservation is being addressed at a country level. Thanks so much.
Person. So we heard from Joanne and Mali about their perspective from the indigenous defender and also like indigenous person who is working in the conservation area. So I'm gonna turn now to Patricia. And Patricia, we heard so much about like we heard from Joanne and Mali about the right to like participation at peak and also the land issues and traditional knowledge and the management of resources. And we understand that several conservation organizations, such including the Nature Conservancy, has taken initiatives on human rights. And I have two questions. One is, could you tell us could you tell us what the right space approach means to you? And second is, so we understand that human rights may not be a new issue for many conservation organizations, including for TNC, but could you tell us how do you assess the value of our initiative and the draft principles that UNEP and John are preparing? And can you see any tangible results or differences this initiative can make? Over to you.
Thank you, Sue. Okay, all right.
It's on now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Su Yang. Greetings, colleagues and friends. As Su Yang mentioned, I'm Patricia. I'm with the Nature Conservancy. And I've been working in community conservation for close to a decade. Sorry, 2 decades. I'm getting old. So it's almost a generation. And I thought I could address this aspect around human rights and my own journey, and also the journey that has been a transition in the Nature Conservancy, where I've done quite a bit of this work mostly in Africa with indigenous people and local communities. And I'd love to share a story around my own journey to kind of put it in perspective. So about 30 years ago, as a young Zambian, I'm from Zambia, I took a school trip to one of Zambia's largest national park, the Kafue National Park. And today we heard about fortress conservation. That park is one which is also a park that was developed in the 50s, and people were taken out of the park. I went to this park for the first time in '85 as an 11-year-old for a school trip. And I remember very vividly, after a long day of travel, we arrived at this national park, a group of about 20 of us kids who'd never been to a national park or in nature. I remember seeing rhinos in the horizon and vividly seeing a whole bustle of rhinos running around. And it was a great sight. Of course, we enjoyed the school trip. Little did I know that at that point, Zambia had a poaching crisis. At the point in the 80s, Zambia had the third largest rhino population, about 18,000. So in that experience, I was able to experience one of the last rhinos in the wild in Zambia. Zambia lost its rhino population to a point of extinction. Today, as I speak, we're reintroducing rhinos. So why do I share the story of rhinos? The story of rhinos is really very closely intertwined with the loss of indigenous and local community rights and stewardship in a lot of our landscapes and areas, especially in the global south where I come from. The models, as we've heard today, in the 80s and 90s, which were fortress conservation, took people's rights away. The rights for people to self-determine their role, their space in protecting these lands they've stewarded for many years. So when I think about human rights, I really think about how human rights are really strongly intertwined with biodiversity, but they are also very intertwined to what we see today as a climate crisis. The ability to have people self-determine their space in this and taking it away has really created this crisis. So with human rights, we really have to position it at the center of our conservation work. And so to the second question, Suyang, so after working for 2 decades in the position as African IPL, Indigenous People and Local Community Strategy Director, where I had the charge of helping the Conservancy develop partnership with Indigenous people and local communities in Africa, I took on this new role at the Conservancy as Global Director of Human Rights and Conservation. It's a new role, and it's the first time the Conservancy has created an Office of Human Rights, and we had a foundational policy that was initiated in 2022 by our global board, which is our Respecting Human Rights policy. So what this did is it laid the framework of how we as an international conservation organization will ensure we are respecting the rights of Indigenous people and local communities. It has it's been built on 4 foundational UN human rights instruments. So the UN Declaration of 1948, the UN Guiding Principles, which John has mentioned, the United Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the ILO standards as well. So we are using these as the building blocks of how we as an international conservation ensure we do no harm and ultimately do good in the work we do. Part of my charge, and I think it builds off what we're talking about, clarifying the norms, is really like, how does this work translate on a day-to-day basis in our work? And so I've been part of the team that's also been thinking around this and putting it into practice in our organization. And a few aspects I'd love to raise is the element around hiring staff that actually are dedicated to ensuring that we are integrating human rights principles and practices in our conservation work and our priorities. So in my office, we are hiring skill sets we've not ordinarily had, which are human rights experts to help conservation staff do work that does do no harm and continues to do good. We have unpacking 4 key pillars which build off some of the clarifying norms. So developing a human rights due diligence framework for the organization This really will be able to identify human rights risks early, assess, and mitigate, communicate. We're also focusing on really thinking around how we partner with Indigenous people and local communities under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and other rights holders. We're beginning to explore the opportunities around developing a grievance redress mechanism at the organizational level. And then finally, we've got a unit that is now beginning to think around the minimum performance standards for ensuring safeguards are in place. And these are safeguards that are really based and integrated from a human rights perspective. I think those kind of are my comments, and I hope I've been able to lay some groundwork there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia. I think she actually responds to like what I said in the beginning, that there's a momentum actually to really move on with the human rights norms in the conservation area. So it's really good to hear about like TNC's own initiatives responding to all the issues that we also Joanne and Mali have raised. So now I'll turn to two other speakers who sent the video messages. And the first one is Astrid Puentes. She's an international expert on human rights and environment, and she's also a former executive director of the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense, also known as IDA. And also our second speaker is Meg Caldwell. She's an ocean director from the Packard Foundation, which is a private foundation. And then also you will see about their perspective on how they see as a funder's role in the conservation and human rights area. So could we have Astrid?
Thank you for the invitation to contribute to this very important workshop. Over the years and all over the world, unfortunately, we have seen how conservation efforts have also violated the rights of Indigenous peoples and of other communities that are based, live, and own a lot of these areas. This because of the ignorance of what are the human rights laws that apply, or because of the premise that nature is better without any human being around. However, and as Western science today's evidence, 80% of biodiversity that we need and want to protect is actually being guarded and protected by Indigenous peoples and a lot of those communities. And in addition to this, the role of women and girls in these communities and in these conservation efforts has been absolutely key. Therefore, finding ways to stop, remediate, and find other models to conserve biodiversity is essential. And today, the human rights guidelines for the conservation organizations can be a key tool for clarifying, advancing, and hopefully also remedying a lot of the human rights violations that conservation efforts have caused. Today, we need urgently to solve the multiple planetary crises, and guidelines such as the ones that we're seeing today for human rights for conservation organizations can be a great tool for these advancements. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Meg Caldwell. I'm the Ocean Director for the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. We're located on the west coast of the United States in California. And I'd like to thank the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Environment Program for giving us the opportunity to speak to the importance of aligning around norms for conservation and human rights from a funder's perspective. The Packard Foundation has been supporting work to advance the integrity and health of our environment over the last 60 years. More broadly, we work with and support people and communities to create durable and equitable solutions for a healthy, resilient, natural world where both people and nature flourish. To achieve this vision, it's vitally important to protect and uphold human rights in conservation work, not just because funders and conservation implementers are duty bearers under international law and standards, but also because the global biodiversity crisis is also a human rights crisis, especially for those people and communities who rely on healthy ecosystems for food, livelihoods, and cultural heritage. We believe that durable conservation solutions are best achieved when those solutions proactively protect and advance the needs, aspirations, and rights of people and communities who are most directly affected. As the world's largest philanthropic funder for ocean science and conservation, we understand how important it is to show leadership at the intersection of planetary health and human well-being. We're honored to be working with the UN Environment Program, human rights experts, other conservation funders, and conservation implementers in clarifying norms for conservation and human rights. Thank you for your attention to this important work.
So now I'll turn to, I'm getting conscious of the time, so I'll turn to our last speaker, David Boyd. And David, I have questions for you. So we have heard from like various speakers on the importance of like clarifying human rights norms in conservation. And could you share some reflections on what we heard today, and also tell us about what will be your recommendation going forward in advancing human rights in the conservation? Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sue Young, and thanks for the opportunity. I've really learned a lot by listening to the various speakers today, and I'll just be very brief so that we have maybe a few minutes for questions. I think it's important to recognize that the science is now crystal clear, that the best way to protect biological diversity is to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples and other traditional place-based communities. That's crystal clear, and there are terrific examples from around the world of rights-based conservation taking place. There are Indigenous-led protected areas in Australia, in Canada, and also very impressive community-based conservation efforts in places like Namibia and Botswana in Africa. And I think we really need to learn from those good practices and teach them to other parts of the world as well. The second thing that I want to be perfectly clear on, and this reiterates what John and Patricia has said, is that rights-based conservation is an obligation, not an option. It's fundamentally important to recognize that. It's not a luxury, it's not the icing on the cake, it's the way all conservation action should be implemented going forward. And I think that the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was negotiated a couple of years ago, when the first draft came out, it made no mention of human rights, no mention of Indigenous peoples' rights. And the final version of that Global Biodiversity Framework is actually very strong on human rights. Multiple references to Indigenous peoples' rights, a reference to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, reference to the rights of women and girls in conservation. And so what we need to really focus on with these guiding principles going forward is making sure that states and conservation organizations, all actors involved in protecting, conserving, and restoring biodiversity, follow the commitments that they have made. And we need to hold states that perpetuate fortress conservation accountable. We need to hold conservation actors that contribute to fortress conservation accountable. And we need to ensure that all actions, as I said, going forward are based with human rights, as Patricia said, human rights really at the center of conservation action. And so I think, you know, these guidelines or principles are really critically important. Getting them out into the world will be vital through meetings of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the World Protected Areas Congress. Love to see it in a resolution, a reference here at the Human Rights Council. And I think that, you know, we are at a critical time in the conservation of biodiversity on Earth. We need to move forward rapidly, but we need to have Indigenous people at the forefront of that movement. Thank you.
Very much, David. And now we have about 10 minutes, so we'll open the floor for questions and comments. And I already have one speaker in line, so I will give the floor to IUCN.
Thank you. Really great to be in this event, and thank you so much for your presentations. So my name is Radhika. I work for the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Our headquarters is in Gland, next to Nyon, just down the road. We are an intergovernmental organization with the permanent observer status on the environment to the UN. And it's really great to hear everybody talking about the very issues we are tackling in our membership. We are a union of 1,400 members. TNC is a member. And in 2016, we actually opened a category of membership for IPOs, Indigenous Peoples Organizations. And in 2021, so we have our Congress every 4 years, they were able to vote in Marseille alongside their governments and other international and national organizations that work in conservation. Now, this category of membership and this work is rocking the conservation community in good and not so good ways. It's unsettling for some, and it's also welcoming for some. So for us, it's really a priority to not so much start looking at how we do human rights in conservation ourselves, but to partner with the human rights community to get this right. I think this is such a delicate topic, so it's not so much about building our own capacities. There has to be, you can't be the jury and the judge. There has to be some level of transparency, strong partnership with the human rights community, with the human rights practitioners to really work with us to get things right and to get our members to move on the same path. So very happy to be here and look forward to our meeting and our discussion after this. Thank you.
Radhika, and do we have any questions or comments in the room or online?
This is UNDP speaking. Just maybe to share some reflections from our side, we're very pleased to co-sponsor this event on this important topic, and we welcome the draft set of principles on conservation and human rights presented here today. I would like to congratulate UN Environment and the Special Rapporteurs for the extensive consultations undertaken in 2023. We also recognize and reaffirm the growing emphasis placed on rights-based approaches under the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework adopted by state parties at the CBD COP15 in 2022. And UNDP also notes that further work is being undertaken on the GBF indicators, including on the topic of protected and conserved areas, governance, and decision-making, and support to environmental human rights defenders as part of targets 3, 21, 22, and 23. We reconfirm our commitment to working with UN Environment and OHCHR on the rollout and implementation of the UN guidance to resident coordinators and UNCTs regarding support to environmental defenders. Furthermore, as part of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, UNDP has pledged to operationalize the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in 100 countries by 2030. So we aim to achieve this by integrating the right to a healthy environment into joint programming under the UNDP Nature Pledge, and also through updating and supporting implementation of national biodiversity strategies and action plans in line with the GBF, as well as by assisting civil society organizations, Indigenous peoples, and local communities in directly accessing finance. And finally, just to say, within UNDP's mandate on governance and rule of law, we are equally committed to deepen our engagement with the judiciary in ensuring access to environmental justice, expand human rights due diligence processes, as well as supporting national human rights institutions. Thank you very much.
And we look forward to working with IUCN and UNDP and other the partners on this. Do we have anybody? Ben?
Thank you. Ben Schachter, UN Human Rights Office, and we're very glad to be part of this discussion as well. But just a quick question, which would be if you could share a little bit more about next steps in terms of how to get these principles acted upon once they're finalized. Obviously, the drafting is ongoing and the consultative process is ongoing. But what's the plan for rolling it out and ensuring uptake?
I mean, more than one of us could answer that question, I think. I'll just highlight a couple of things. I think one is we're hoping through, again, wide consultations that we've been having with conservation organizations, funders, but also indigenous organizations and other rights-based organizations to have widespread endorsement so that there's a general consensus around these going forward. A lot of, as Patricia says, a lot of conservation organizations and funders are already thinking about this, and some have already, taken serious steps in this direction. I think what would be great is if these norms help shape what they're doing and help clarify what they need to do, but also then provide a kind of standard by which what they're doing could be assessed. I also want to just emphasize what Soo-Yung said at the outset, that another kind of idea that has come out of this is the idea of a regular forum on conservation and human rights that would meet, and one of the things that it could do is talk about how to address the issue you raised, how to ensure implementation and uptake.
Quickly, another point on this. So our approach is also to get the buy-in from all the stakeholders, including especially indigenous peoples, and to have a bottom-up approach to this issue. Because a lot of policies, through the consultation, a lot of indigenous peoples and the communities, they were telling us that they don't want a top-down approach to conservation anymore. So they want to have the ownership to this idea and the principles. So we want to have their buy-in. And we also we are getting quite a lot of their endorsement on it. So that's one approach. And so we have still ongoing discussions about this, how to take this forward. And one of the ideas is to actually pilot this principles. So we're having some conversation with the conservation organizations and some others about once this is finalized and we have enough endorsement, what about we pilot this? And this can be also reported to this the forum that we are envisioning, like Forum on Human Rights and Conservation, and keep monitoring and learning from the experience. So.
Just along the lines of the forum, there's also been discussion this week, including with the president of the Human Rights Council, about having a special session this year on the planetary crisis and human rights. And I think it would be critically important to have a component of that special session focused on conservation and human rights, and for sure representation of indigenous peoples.
Thank you, David. So I think we have 1 minute left. So I'll just say thank you, everybody, for participating in this discussion today, and also all speakers and co-sponsors and those who joined us here today and also online, and also our colleagues at Juliana and Richard, and also Diana and Harvey, who made this event possible. And lastly, I want to say Happy International Women's Day, and thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. So this is our start.